Definitely very excited about observability. I got into building Wavefront, which was a web scale observability platform around 10 years ago. So I just want to maybe share a little bit of that journey because, kind of my career starting at Google obviously influenced kind of how I look at monitoring, how I looked at observability, and why I kind of started building a company, right? Actually, kind of leveraging what I've learned from kind of the Google way maybe 10 years ago of, transcending beyond just pure monitoring. And then actually building the company, actually selling it to a lot of web scale companies in the Bay Area. We got bought by VMware in 2017. And I basically, became a principal engineer at VMware, selling Wavefront to even more businesses, right? We were mostly selling to startups in the early days of Wavefront. And then at VMware, as a VP and principal engineer, I was mostly going to every bank possible, since we're talking in a banking scenario in New York and in all the geos on the planet, just trying to just sell Wavefront. It's now their ARIA operations. It's still actually a product that is being sold. But I want to start with just talking about why we are here, right? Why we have observability, right? As the introduction kind of mentioned, I started at Google, and I think kind of it gave a new view of, or a unique perspective, I should say, as I started my career, because Google didn't embrace kind of the traditional enterprise kind of tool chain, right? They built nowadays, I guess, a open source version of that would be Kubernetes. They have their own cluster management system. All the way, if you don't know, like Google built their own routers and switches and basically did not use anything, off the shelf. Like it was all custom firmware that was flashed onto devices. And so you could imagine like just software development is just basically a way of shipping software at Google when I was there in the early 2000s. And I think as part of that journey, we realized like we need monitoring tools. And at that point in the industry, I think it was mostly logging. So you would be using Splunk, you'd be using, maybe there's Elk or certain earlier incarnations of that thereof. And but when I first left Google, I realized Google was a heavily metrics-based company. It was mainly monitoring was done through time series analytics. And when I left Google and started my first company actually in the finance space, I realized most companies are just using Splunk. And it felt, I'm sure, nowadays as we look back in how that evolution became, viable, like, logs was good, but it was good for unstructured data and, and analytics for a web scale company, I should say, is not very viable as from a cost perspective, from a performance perspective, and also from a reactionary like monitoring perspective. So we looked at, when my first company, it was not in the monitoring space, but we basically have to use the logging products out there, and which sparked a thought in our mind, which is, why don't we actually ship metrics, right? Why don't we ship a product? Why don't we build this thing, which, became kind of the fundamental, monitoring piece at Google, that is metrics monitoring. And so we started that journey of Wavefront with that thesis in mind, right? So the date that was given in the introduction is correct, right? We didn't start building an observability product. It was really just metrics monitoring, which today, if you look at the open source space, that would be something like Prometheus, maybe a little bit early on, maybe OpenTSDB, and then maybe even earlier on, that would be, kind of the various on-off system that detects whether something is Nagios, for example. And so we thought we were building this metrics product, and then gradually this observability concept came into being, and it started to blend three things together, which was, companies always had logs, and probably will forever have logs. And metrics is coming to be this kind of a time series atom that allows you to very quickly slice and dice data. It's pretty compressible. It's very easy to manipulate from a mathematical perspective. And it's pretty easy to alert, right? So you can monitor CPU usage, memory usage. It could be your business applications. It could be middleware. It could be hardware, all of that. Like you could kind of emit metrics, and you could measuring that. And it looks nice on charts, and people could look at them in kind of in network operation centers. And then at the same time, the third piece was tracing, right? If you remember, there's a company called Lightstep, which created this standard called open tracing. Open tracing married with open census from Google to form what is open telemetry today. But it was basically, originally, at least for open tracing, was an idea that tracing could, become more developer focused, right? Like when you write code, you would write logging statements, you would write metrics using things like Spring, Metric Registry, or any of the other open source libraries that you could use. But also like for tracing, it would be part and parcel for building software. And that's kind of all three of those pieces together, I feel, was kind of also a reaction to kind of in parallel happening kind of APM track, right? If you're coming from a traditional, especially a Java shop, you would have an APM product, which could be Dynatrace, it could be New Relic, it could be what else? The CA had an earlier product, and all of those Wiley, and all of those could be used because you did not want to probably change your code, right? You always, those APM products were something that operations would deploy, and developers would use them, obviously, but operations people would use it because maybe it is a packaged piece of software. You don't have control over whether it emits metrics, whether it emits traces. And so you would pick an APM product to allow you to do kind of monitor any black box Java application. Right. When we built Wavefront and we were selling, we were kind of facing all of this. Right? I'm trying to paint the picture. Right. There's that APM landscape for many enterprises. A lot of startups are embracing the metrics tracing ecosystem. And so, for the startups, it made sense for them to adopt something like Wavefront. So we were able to get into the door with companies like Groupon, Lyft, DoorDash, PayPal. I mean, there's a whole bunch of 8x8. A lot of companies, Reddit, actually, one of our big customers as well. And so they were all kind of web scale companies that needed to, figure out how to monitor, and probably not APM because of cost, and also it doesn't really understand, at that point at least, kind of microservice architectures running in things like Kubernetes. And also the idea there was to have monitoring and observable code be part of the deliverable, right? So as we talk to developers, like they want to be in charge of what they are monitoring, what they're measuring, and kind of as an acceptance criteria, code needs to be traceable, right? So it's emitting traces, so you could actually understand kind of complex interactions between systems, right? So this is kind of the startup ecosystem. We sold to that customer base still pretty well today. I left VMware, I guess, but they're still, as far as I know, selling pretty well to the startup ecosystem. But we are also, looking at how to target the enterprise market, right? And I think this is kind of where we are meeting a lot of the banks in the US. And to be honest, like we have been struggling, right? At my days at VMware, we were struggling because, a lot of them have APM systems. A lot of them are trying to adopt new paradigms like DevOps, running on Kubernetes, trying to run microservices, trying to be, migrating from things like mainframes. But they're not quite there yet, right? Thinking about how do they then, drop their APM tools, or oftentimes we go into a bank and they said they have 40 tools and you're selling me one more, and so what are you replacing? And that's kind of always that we felt was hard to transcend, right? Because you give a really powerful kind of metrics platform, but it's just kind of like selling them like MySQL, like it's giving them a database, it's giving them a cloud footprint, but that's not, for the most part, I think customers, especially in the banking sector, was looking at something that could be more holistic, right? And I think that's where, when I heard about VuNet, like after I left VMware, like this was particularly interesting, because I think kind of we went from APM and we now have, let's say, these fundamental atoms of logs and metrics and traces, but we're missing this kind of, like, it used to be an APM, I suppose, like all these business journey monitoring and, scoring, whether it's AppDex or monitoring critical interactions, looking at failures and trying to assign blame. All the kind of stuff was in APM, but it wasn't actually in, kind of the, let's say, the Elk stack, the Prometheus stack and the tracing stack, like let's say Jaeger or Zipian. But I think VuNet is bringing this particular perspective, which I find was, truly interesting, because they're taking a lot of this data, but slicing it in a different way, right? So at Wavefront, like we build a kind of horizontal product. You could apply it to all sorts of different companies, right? Whether it's like Lyft, it's a logistic company. If it was Groupon, then it was selling coupons on the internet. But I think what I see is becoming more relevant, especially in the enterprise market, is to look at it from a vertically integrated perspective, right? So basically to look at what are the most interesting transactions from a banking perspective, right? To look at, because a lot of the data have annotations that as a platform, those are just obviously data bits that we have to store, but we can't really stitch things together. And I think, talking to Ashwin especially, like, the payment industry has a bunch of understanding about how payments happen, right? It should be asynchronous, it's talking to third-party processors, and all of that is a unique perspective on the data that just a general platform wouldn't understand. And I would argue actually even an APM product probably wouldn't understand, right? And so being able to say, let's graduate from, kind of the more, I'd say, old school APM products, going into embracing kind of these web scale concepts like tracing, metrics, and logs, but then having a system that ties those atoms together, bringing you the ability to look at those business journey visualization and looking at monitoring those critical transactions, trying to figure out what the root cause analysis of why failures happen. And I think all of those are the reason why I think you're probably in this talk today. And yeah, so I think just from my perspective, looking at how the industry is moving along, I think we're in this space where I think we have figured out the atoms. We've figured out how to kind of pivot the responsibility back to developers, and now we're in the process of trying to figure out what are all the business operations, business journey analytics that can be done on top of these atoms. And I think this is where VuNet excels. After leaving VMware, because I never quite had the chance to sit down and try out all of the competitors. So I had the chance to have some downtime, and so I actually looked at things like Dynatrace and see what the competitive competition or what APM, the latest APM is up to, right? Especially since I advise companies on observability and also both in building observability software and also actually achieving observability in their enterprise or their company. And I think the fundamental for APM is that they are mostly going to be heavily leaning on their agents, right? You talked about the sidecars. As I said, I think it came from a world where operations was the silo, if you will, that owned monitoring, right? And so developers are not involved in that conversation. And so you needed to be able to essentially whatever that is running in production, whether it's middleware or whether it's software that it was built in-house, you need to monitor that. You need to figure out why it's broken. Mostly it's going to be very database centric as well early on. And so it was always this concept that you don't need developers to be involved, right? You don't need, even your infrastructure or your cloud to give you insights, because I'm going to give you an agent or a sidecar that's able to scrape that data and send it back to the vendor itself. And I think the shift that's happening in the industry is both code itself. Like I don't know if folks are familiar with Spring Boot, the most popular Java framework, application framework there, like version 3 of it is primarily about tracing. If you go look at their release notes. And so like the product that is being shipped, I mean, the binaries that are being shipped, whether it's containers or just a jar or a war, like they are going to be instrumented, right? The developers are either using frameworks that are instrumented that will give you metrics, traces, and logs coming out of it, or they actually either using the framework itself. The developers are actually putting those statements themselves, right? And I think to draw a parallel with metrics, the moment that developers realize like they could add instrumentation to their code that helps them solve issues in production, this becomes a virtuous cycle, right? So code itself becomes instrumented, becomes observable, right? It becomes a property of the code that it is observable. And so I think the day will come, I believe, where things like even service meshes, or if you're on Kubernetes or any cloud, all of those things itself is generating metrics, it's itself generating logs, it's itself generating traces, right? And so the idea that you need another piece of software that somehow introspects a JVM or introspects the infrastructure to generate those metrics, again, whether it's traces, metrics, or traces, I think those days are, I would say, numbered. I mean, obviously, some legacy software will still probably require APM products. So I see the industry slowly moving towards, again, you still need that storage tier to store all of that data that's being generated. But I think where VuNet and hopefully, in other enterprises, probably other vertical aligned companies will emerge, where we have then you have all the data. You don't have these proprietary agents. Regardless of where you run, the applications themselves are generating those observability atoms. and you're catching them and you're storing them, but how do you create insights out of them, right? How do you, you talked about predictive insights, right? That would be kind of the next stage, right? To figure out if something's broken, do the root cause analysis, trying to figure out where the fault is happening, and then be able to do predictive insights to figure out, what something, whether something is going to break, right, in the future, and be able to predict with a certain degree of certainty. And I think, again, I think of VuNet in this particular instance, looking at being able to understand banking concepts, right? Whether it's, again, coming in from a third party, coming in from your own software, and being able to understand like what are the critical transactions is key. I would just end with a story, right? Because when we work with Lyft, the ride-sharing company, I think you're probably more familiar with Uber, but Lyft and Uber are basically the two big competitors in the US. We actually, as the metrics platform, we don't actually understand what they're sending us, because it's like enormous amount of data, right? We're talking about millions of data points per second, and it's all from their infrastructure, a lot of from their code or from their applications, but we actually don't understand what the transaction is even, right? Because obviously it's a ride in Lyft's case, but a ride has so many bits and pieces that needs to happen perfectly, right, before you could actually call a car and the car comes, and obviously payment and then reviews, stars, and all that kind of stuff. And then obviously during the entire ride, a lot of telemetry data. So, but we were just that platform, right? We don't have the ability even to suggest that we have insights into the data. And I think this is why I believe like a vertical solution makes sense, because if you were building just an observability platform, or the at least the interpretation layer of that data, for a ride-sharing company, you probably know what I just said, right? You probably know like, okay, it's rides, it has a beginning and an end, it has payments, it has reviews, it has matching process, all the kind of stuff you kind of know. And I think in the banking sense, I think where a vertically integrated solution like VuNet shines would be in this similar aspect, right? Because how payments are happening, how they ought to happen. What is a high value transaction versus a low value transaction? And I think that is the reason why I think this is kind of the next stage, right? It's trying to figure out these business journeys from observability data, and then applying AI ML to do root cause analysis and predictive analytics.